This afternoon's webinar is a collaboration between GIRI and Zurich regarding avoiding damage from construction fires. Firstly, I'd just like to run through some webinar housekeeping. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube, that's the GIRI YouTube channel, should you or any of your colleagues who aren't here wish to look at it again later. Should you wish to make a comment whilst we're speaking, perhaps you could raise your hand using the appropriate buttons on the WebEx software and use the chat box to share your ideas, which we'll be picking up as we go through, and perhaps using in the question and answer at the end if we don't pick them up as we go through. Please could you mute your microphone unless speaking, and we will mute if we need to. And also, please could you switch your cameras off? The reason for this is it keeps the use of the internet to a minimum and get less feedback. So thanks for that. Today's agenda. Firstly, I'm going to give us an update on GIRI and the formation of GIRI and why there's a GIRI, and some feedback on previous forums. Then we're going to hear from our speakers, Robert and Matthew, and then there'll be a time at the end to have some questions and answers and perhaps a summary if it's appropriate. My name's Cliff Smith. I'm the recently appointed Executive Director of GIRI following the sad loss of Tom Barton towards the end of last year. The Get It Right initiative was formed originally as a movement to look at improving value by eliminating error in the construction industry, and there was a research project done in 2015, and what this showed us was that 21% of the gross turnover of the construction industry was wasted as it was spent on putting things right. It was spent as a consequence of error. There was the direct costs, the indirect costs, the unrecorded process waste. Well, this is errors and mistakes that are made and put right without actually ever being recorded. And then, of course, we have latent defects, which I'm sure our insurers are familiar with, where errors come to light after projects have completed the construction phase and are in use. So out of the gross 100 billion of turnover in the construction industry, 20 billion is spent on waste, and it's like an iceberg. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg in the direct effects. Our research showed the root causes of error, and interestingly, these are mostly in the planning and design stage. And I think this is particularly relevant to today's discussion in that it's planning and designing ready to minimize the impact of fire that will become clear as Matthew and Robert go through their part of the presentation. But as you can see, excessive commercial time, financial and time pressures, poor management, and inadequate planning are some of the main reasons for error in construction. And fire, well, this particular fire, I'm sure you're all familiar with this picture, the Grenfell Disaster. Now, this occurred obviously during occupation, but can you imagine under construction, this tower block under construction with the cladding all in place, but perhaps not the full fire protection systems in place? And this is where we need to think what we need to think about today in terms of construction fires. If we're halfway through a construction project, sometimes the full protection might not be in place. So coming out of that very sad situation at Grenfell, Dame Judith Hackett did a report, and this is a quotation from that report. Any part of this sector who thinks they can survive by standing still or defending their current territory is sadly mistaken. The construction industry's got to move forward. and we've got to learn from our mistakes. And today we're going to be doing some learning. The strategic aim of GIRI is to improve construction. We want to improve construction productivity, quality, and waste reduction by eliminating error. These are some of the forums we've had recently, and we've had very good feedback from them. Checking procedures, behaviours, culture, materials and supply chain, and getting better knowledge, meaning fewer errors. So we're very pleased today. We've got 59 members currently of GIRI. This was as of December 2020. And you can see the wide range of members, from major clients to supply chain, technical outfits, and SMEs. So moving on to the main subject of the day, avoiding damage from construction fires. Robert Innes and Matthew Porter are both representatives of Zurich, and they will now take us through the presentation. So I think I'm handing over now to Matthew.
Okay, well, I'm just going to take you through the first couple of slides. I'll just talk while Matt's just putting it into presenter mode. So thank you for sparing an hour and a half of your afternoon in lockdown just to join us today. So today we're going to be going through trying to avoid damage on construction sites from fires. So it's going to be myself just doing an introduction, and then Matt's going to take us through. So if you just want to take me through to the first slide, Matt. So today we're just going to talk about, just give you a bit of background as to why we're doing a webinar on this topic. So this will be our third webinar. The first one was on escape of water, and then we were looking at, our second one was more of an insurance insight. So we'll just give you a background as to why we've chosen this topic to present yourself today. So Matt's going to take you through some fire losses that we've experienced recently, just give you a bit of background information into them, some areas of concern that we've had following these, and then he's just going to give you a little bit of insurance insight. And then he'll take you through 3 losses, and then he'll take you back over to me, and then I'm just going to take you through some areas where we could be doing better. So lessons learned and hopefully getting it right. And then hopefully we should have about 30 minutes at the end of the presentation for anyone to ask any questions. So feel free to put anything in the chat box, and we'll either try and address it during the presentation, but if not, we can always pick it up at the end. So next slide, please, Matt. Okay, so why have we chosen avoiding construction fires? Fires is one of our biggest areas of losses at Zurich. So not only just in a construction point of view, but also property. They cause extensive amount of damage when they occur. And as you can just see some of the facts on there, that between 2015 and 2019, there are over 1,600 fires that had to be attended by the local fire brigade. So that's obviously quite a lot. So that's like on average 5 a day. And of these, 28 were caused by hot work activities. And we've seen some large losses in recent years, and they're becoming more prevalent again, unfortunately. So we just want to try and address this issue and see what we can do to try and improve things. So if you go back to the previous slide, please, Matt. There we go. So yeah, so just I mean, in Zurich alone, so that we're only one insurance carrier, we've seen £250 million of losses in recent years. You know, from a property point of view, in 2018 alone, we saw £1.3 billion of losses. So when we start seeing losses of this magnitude and this frequency, it makes us a little bit nervous, and this then gets reflected in things like premium and coverage. And so, we want to try and help you to try and minimize these events that are happening, and then, it'll help you in return, in the sense that you hopefully won't see as many claims, and it may affect your premium. And then just lastly, before we start going on to construction losses, you can see this is just an extract of a presentation recently, and these are just large losses in the last 24 months, and you can see the ones highlighted in red are those related to fire, and the one at the bottom, the 37.6 million loss, was the one that happened with the grade listed building, Glasgow School of Art. So you can see that these are significant losses that we're seeing. So, and this is again why we want to address the issue. So I'm just going to hand you over to Matt. He's just going to take you through a few losses, and then I'll pick you up a bit later. Matt, you're on mute, mate.
Yeah, the big box that says unmute me is a bit of a giveaway. Apologies for that. Apologies for the lack of control over the slides earlier as well. But as Rob said, I'm just going to take you through some claims examples of fires that we've dealt with within the construction team. The first one, there's some background information up here. 10-storey existing building undergoing renovation, and there were works being undertaken on the 7th floor. This floor had an open chimney void, and the floor was open to the elements, so there was wind accessing this chimney void. There was no cavity barrier in place within the chimney, as it was in a temporary condition. And of note and worth mentioning, but not pivotal or not causative of the fire, there was a tar boiler being used at roof level. So the fire event itself started on the 7th floor around mid-morning, and there was lack of fire extinguishers available, and the fire was not able to be put out quickly, and effectively the fire travelled quickly to the upper levels through the chimney void, which was assisted in its speed in doing so by the wind that was coming through the chimney void. Ultimately, it took 50 plus firefighters about 7 hours to control or bring the fire under control. So areas of concern from a risk management perspective: the project didn't have a hot work system in place. The project didn't produce an overall project fire risk management plan for the construction phase. Plans were produced midway through the project and by individual subcontractors, but there was a quite clear lack of coordination between the parties involved. There was a lack of temporary fire barriers for voids connected different floors. There was a lack of barriers / shields in place to prevent any wind spreading sparks and embers from and effectively exacerbating a fire event. Although not responsible for this fire, as we've already touched upon, the presence of a tar boiler on the roof and the use of the same is a bit of a concern. From an insurance insight perspective, this was a £20 million loss, ultimately settled at £12 million. From a policy point of view, the first issue was the actual value of contract works completed at the time of the fire. This is a perennial issue where you have, even if it's just contract works, but I think this particular example, there was existing structures, retained structures in place. So it was a refurbishment of an existing building, and there will always need to be that delineation between what is construction, all risks, and what is covered under the property cover. So obviously the retained existing structures would have been covered under the property cover, unless there was some sort of existing structures cover provided by the contractor's all risk policy. Generally, that will be sublimited. It will be an assessment given by the contractor as to if he has to reinstate that retained part, how much would it cost? But it's quite usual to just have that separated and put into the property cover. So the certified value of work completed was overstated by the contractor, and it was successfully challenged by the loss adjuster. So as a rule of thumb, the maximum loss that you're going to incur is going to be to the sum of the contract works that you have built, and generally, no more. Insurers won't pay for property that's not yet been built. There's a couple of caveats to that, in terms of you may get cover as a memorandum, additional cover in a contractors all risk policy for additional cost of unbuilt works, but they're likely to have a relatively low sublimit. So if you have existing structures cover, under this contractors all risk policy, this shouldn't necessarily be an issue. But if you haven't got that cover, that part of the claim will need to be presented to the property insurer. There must be a robust cost tracking undertaken to split out these costs, as the construction policy won't be paying any costs related to items that are covered under the property cover. Even if you've got existing structures cover in place, which we've already touched upon, that will have a sublimit, as it's based on the contractor's estimate for reinstating that existing structure if required. This claim was also interesting in that it spawned a number of liability losses. The liability cover is a sectional cover under the contractors all risks policy that we were dealing with here. And because you have multiple parties insured under the cover, they're all treated separately and distinctly. So you can have a situation where the party A is basically defending a claim from party B. They're both insured under the policy, but they can make claims against each other. And we had a situation exactly on point with that. Effectively, what had happened was that a number of adjudications had taken place regarding time delays, and that had moved its way down to the contractual chain. Unfortunately, the contractor, probably at the bottom of the chain, ended up receiving a liability loss from his direct contractual party relationship above him. And they effectively pursued a claim for what were time delay related damages, liquidated damages. Under the CAR policy, you will usually see an exclusion for fines and liquidated damages. In this situation, the exclusion didn't apply. It will generally be the case, if it's a straightforward, you've received a claim for liquidated damages, that will not be indemnified by a liability cover within a contractors all risk policy. The reason why we did deal with this particular claim was it wasn't a direct claim to recover liquidated damages, it was a claim in contribution. So that is made possible by the Civil Liability Contribution Act of 1978. So basically, the contractual party above the lowest tier subcontractor were passing those losses down the contractual chain by way of contribution. They'd already had to pay an amount for delay damages to their immediate contracting party above. It's quite an unusual situation, and one wouldn't rely on the ability to have liquidated damages covered under this type of cover. The last point to make is in terms of compliance with the Joint Code of Practice on fire prevention. It was interesting that subsequent to this loss, I think mine and Rob's risk engineering colleagues were quite interested in this particular project, and subsequently there were breaches in the Joint Code of Practice discovered by a site visit. Those breaches were subject to a remedy notice to the main contractor, and that remedy notice was not complied with within the stipulated time period, which ultimately meant that Zurich suspended the construction cover on site, and without that cover, the site effectively had to shut down. So I suppose the point really is that I'm making is that these things are vitally important. They're vitally important that you comply with them, and it can have serious consequences for a claim or for your insurance cover going forward. And without it, you're going to struggle to operate. Okay, so the next slide. This is example number 2. So this is an existing 5-storey listed building. Again, there'll be retained structures there, being partially extended and also refurbished. The building was to remain operational during the works. The fire event itself occurred when works were being undertaken on a flat roof during the morning, and the subcontractor left the work area unattended. The fire started to spread to the lower floors through voids in the roof. The fire was initially detected by smoke on the lower floors and by members of staff working in the building, i.e. not the subcontractor themselves. And emergency services were contacted by a member of the public who obviously saw smoke exiting the building from street level. And this required the attendance of 100+ firefighters to control the blaze, quite a serious fire. So the areas of concern from a risk management perspective for us were that the project did have a hot work permit system. However, there was an inadequate fire watch. Clearly, the subcontractor had undertaken some work and then left the area. They weren't watching for any signs of fire or ignition. And the fire alert itself, as we said, wasn't raised by the subcontractor, but by members of the public and I think staff members in the building. So there were inadequate fire protection measures between the existing and the new building, resulting in fire spreading into the new extension part of the building. And temporary fire screens separating the two buildings had been destroyed or removed, not quite sure which. From an insurance insight perspective, it was a 6.75 million loss, recently settled at about 4.7 million. From a policy perspective, some interesting points arose here. So there was no existing structures cover on this particular project. So any damage to existing structures or property would be picked up by the property insurer. So you've got that already. You've got a complication to some extent of interacting with two insurers. So exclusion 7, again, this is really tying in with that particular issue about what's contract works and what is property. So the contract works cover has an insured property handed over exclusion. Effectively, this exclusion is for loss, destruction or damage to insured property handed over to the employer, simply put, and that would be evidenced by a taking over certificate or other evidence of completion. Similarly, the subsequent exclusion, again, very much on the same line, insured property taken into use. So this exclusion is for loss, destruction or damage to insured property occurring when such property is taken into use by the party for whom the works are undertaken. In that case, it was the employer. And it turned out that various areas of the store had been handed back to the employer and were being used to either store retail goods or act as actual retail shop floor space. Now, this was slightly difficult for us to evidence initially. In terms of the comment here about documentation of handed over areas of contract works, it was difficult to pull that information together, but was ultimately sufficient for us to show to the property insurers that there were actually a number of areas that have been handed over to the employer. I think as a contractor, or anyone undertaking works in a project like this, it's something to think about if you're responsible for handing over areas of the works in terms of what documents you need to evidence that, and segregating them and storing them appropriately so you can access them and provide all of that information together. The multiple insured clause was an interesting issue on this. So this basically allows the interaction between all the parties insured under the policy not to be under threat from having recovery or subrogation actions initiated against them. So if you come within the ambit of being an insured under the cover, you get protection under this clause from people coming after you in the events of you've done something wrong. You may have done something wrong, but the idea with this kind of cover providing multiple parties with cover is to try and stop that blame game, finger pointing, and people suing each other. It doesn't really foster a sort of collegiate approach in getting on and getting the project completed and finished. So basically, if you are an insured, generally you'll find that other insureds can't pursue recoveries against you, and the insurers of other insureds can't pursue recoveries against you. So there was an issue over the roofing contractor that was thought to have started the blaze. It was questioned whether or not he had a contractual entitlement to get the benefit of the project policy cover. And if he didn't get the benefit of the cover, he was outside of that subrogation waiver protection. So it's an important aspect, really, an important point to just think about. Always check that the contracts that you're entering into reflect the intentions of the parties with regards to the benefit of contractors or risks cover. Because otherwise, it's very likely that your liability insurance will be exposed. And ultimately, that could lead to increased premiums if a claim is paid, or more worryingly, if you don't have sufficient cover, a large uninsured loss that parties will be trying to pursue against you as an entity. I can't underestimate that particular point. Ultimately, we decided not to pursue the subcontractor, as he did have limited liability cover in place, and there were potentially multiple parties that would be interested in pursuing that. So it would have required us to have litigated a case against him, obtained a judgment, first ahead of everyone else to get access to his limit of indemnity, and there were just too many time and uncertainty issues that came into play on that. It wasn't really economical for us to pursue that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last claims example, and this was a £20 million plus project. Completion date had already been extended by 12 months before the fire. And the risk assessments carried out confirmed that this project was a high fire risk site. Works involve use of blowtorch to repair, in this situation, a leaking section of flat roof. And these works took place on a section of flat roof adjacent to a sloping roof made from combustible materials. There was a void in the sloping roof that contained organic combustible material. The permit was open from 8 AM in the morning till midday, and it confirmed that precautions had been taken to protect the non-movable combustible materials. The permit required a 2-hour fire watch and water extinguisher to be present. The fire event itself occurred after works had ended mid-morning and the permit being closed, nearly an hour and a half after the works had ceased, and workers left site 3 hours later. The fire was spotted by a member of the public at around about 5 PM. Mostly We understood the cause to be sparks and hot embers entering the void on the slope roof where the combustible materials were located. And the roof was completely destroyed by the fire, but substantial damage occurred to the main buildings from the water used to extinguish it, as well as neighbouring third-party buildings. So areas of concern from a risk management perspective, adjacent combustible materials were not adequately protected. There were empty cigarette packets found on the roof, suggesting that it was maybe an unofficial smoking area. Foam and CO2 fire extinguisher provided. One was overdue a service by several months and partially discharged already, and no water extinguisher was provided as required. No additional fire watch was undertaken at the end of the working day, as really should have been expected on such a high-risk site. The insurance insight that the loss was stated around about £3 million. We didn't pay anything on this particular claim. And from an insurance policy points of view discussion perspective, so the first point is difference in conditions cover. So this again, ties back to the whole contractual arrangements about insurance and who's responsible for procuring it. In this particular example, the employer had to procure a project cover. So the contractor that we were insuring were covered under that. They had the contractual rights to that insurance, but the claim they presented to our policy was on the basis of a difference in conditions cover. So that's in place where you've got this underlying project cover. In the event that that project cover doesn't respond, generally you'll find that wider cover is given under the DIC or difference in conditions sectional cover that we provide under a CAR annual policy. Unfortunately, in this situation, both policies had the joint code of practice on protection from fire clause in place. So the DIC cover for our policy would only respond after the project policy had confirmed that there was no cover available. But ultimately, our cover had the same issues in terms of non-compliance with the joint code of practice as the project policy. And any claim value could have been offset in a damages claim by insurers against the contractor for non-compliance with the clause. So just, again, stepping back to our comments made earlier about, this JCOP provision is quite a stringent provision that you do need to really take notice of and comply with. And we talk about the sort of language used about compliance. It's not do your best or, well, have a go. It's quite stringent words used in that clause. And you find that a lot in insurance policies, particularly contractors all risk policies. So it was alleged by the contractor and the contractor's broker that the joint code of practice on fire prevention was only relevant to setting up a system for fire prevention on the site. And once that had been done, the obligation to comply with JCOP ceased. We found that at first blush very, very strange. It seemed totally at odds with the intention of the clause, which is, protection from fire of construction sites and construction sites undergoing renovation. That suggests to us that, it was a not limited in part of the process undertaken to get things set up. It was for the duration of the whole project until that work was handed over to the employer as complete. Why would you set up systems and then not utilise them throughout the course of construction? So turning to the words that are quite important in this particular clause, the words undertakes to comply. They're an absolute obligation under a contract of insurance. We had obtained the QC's a barrister's advice on this issue, and he confirmed our understanding of those key words. And on this occasion, despite asserting to insurers that the joint code of practice had been complied with, the contractor did not provide any evidence to show that this had been done. And this was in breach of condition 1 within that policy wording, to give all such information and assistance as insurers may reasonably require. And again, that's something that you will find, maybe not in those exact words, but variants of that in the vast majority of contractors or risk wordings. Generally, there was a lack of engagement and cooperation by the contractor. He's telling us one thing and could have easily, moved the discussion on by providing evidence to support his contentions, but he didn't, chose not to. And again, probably those who've seen me speak before, I'd reiterate that cooperation with your insurers is absolutely key in these kind of claims, and really in any claim. If you don't comply with requirements to provide information, your insurer is not going to be paying your claim, and certainly not paying your claim quickly. Ultimately, with the issues that had been experienced by the contractor on this loss, the claim against our policy was withdrawn. So hence why we paid nothing on this particular loss. Okay, I think that brings me to the end of the fire examples, insurance insight. So I believe Rob's going to take you through the remainder of the slides.
Just going to do that. I'm just going to get my presenter up. Okay, so just a little bit of interaction here. So just a quick question to the audience is, do you think at present, and you can put your answers in the chat function, as to whether you think that we do enough to prevent fires, construction fires? So I'd be interested to see what people's thoughts are on that. So whether you think we do enough at the moment, we don't need to do any more, whether we could do, we could improve things. So just let me know, that would be great. Okay, so we've got two answers. I mean, generally, what we find is that, the construction industry has made some improvements, and obviously that's been related to improving fire safety, life safety from a health and safety point of view. But we think a lot more could be done, particularly focusing on property protection, and not just focusing on lives. I think if you actually go with the intent of actually protecting your property, life safety will follow suit as well. So what I'm looking to do now is just take you through a few areas that we think things could be looked at, improved upon, and just sharing through our experiences. So I'm just going to take you through eliminating and reducing risk where possible, looking at fire management plans. So I'll come to your question, Cliff, on that one. Again, looking at the hot permit system. Again, you would have noted in a few of the examples that Matt went through that most of them, 2 of the 3, and actually a lot of the fires that we see, they've all got hot water permits. So, that's not quite delivering what it's intended. So we need to look at trying to make that a more robust system. Again, looking at technology to see what technology we can use to help assist us in reducing this risk. And again, then looking at training and fire compartmentation for the construction site. So I'm just going to take you through those now. So just to reiterate what Matt said, particularly with the last loss in mind, it is really important that you comply with the joint code of practice. It's not just a best practice document that if you can follow it, you should. You have to, because if you don't, there is a risk that you won't get insurance coverage. And again, as Matt's reiterated, it's not just complying with it. You might have to show evidence that you have complied with this in the event of a fire. So again, in that last loss, they were asked to show how they protected their materials, how they did their fire watches, and provide actual evidence. So it's just something that's really important to bear in mind. I think the first port of call for reducing the risk of hotwork fires is to try and eliminate the risk at source. So again, we should just be asking ourselves, do we need to be doing this? And there's an alternative method such as cold working. And again, on the last loss that Matt referenced, they were asked that question is, what did you do to eliminate that risk? Did you actually investigate alternative methods? So again, that's something that we should be looking at, demonstrating and evidencing where you can. And if you can't reduce it, we're not, there are some hotwork activities that need to take place. But again, it's just giving some thought as to, can we do this offsite? Can we prefabricate? If so, if we have to do it on site, can we do it outside of the building? It's just absolutely reducing the hotwork activities in a building to the absolute minimum and really giving us some thought. And I think this is where clients should be challenging contractors, contractors should be challenging clients. Everyone should be challenging everyone in an environment where everyone feels comfortable to do so, because it just means that, we can be looking at this and just ensuring that we have actually done our best to reduce this. And an area that we see when we go around looking at construction projects is we'll always have to have a look at your construction fire risk management plan. So often we see plans that for the permanent condition, and we hear about the permanent protection measures that are in place, but we're actually really concerned about what measures are in place in the construction phase, and this should all be documented in your fire management plan for the construction stage. So everyone should have one, every project should have one. It's meant to be a standalone project and you should produce one. So to answer Cliff's question, it is required. It can be appended and put into your construction phase plan, but it still has to be a standalone document. And my guidance is that this should be a document. Effectively, you should be looking through the JCOB and addressing each section and demonstrating how you're complying and what measures you're putting in place to look at that. So you should be addressing security, and whether you're using acetylene, your hot work permit systems. Every section in that JCOB should really be addressed. And quite often we see on construction projects, they'll produce a fire risk assessment, but that's it. And that to me is not sufficient. You need a plan in addition to a fire risk assessment. And the sort of analogy that I would look at is, think of it as like your RAMs. You do your risk assessments to outline what the risks are and what pose to the project, but then also the method statement in which you're going to be using, or what methods you're going to be using to carry out the works. So what are the risks in the risk assessment and the methods that you're actually going to be doing it. And the same applies to a fire risk management plan. Look at that as your method statement. That should document exactly how you are actually going to reduce the risks on site. And then you produce your right risk assessment in addition to that. And again, these plans should be produced before you start on site, and they should be continually reviewed and updated as you progress, because obviously every construction project's evolving and the risk change. And as we find is the risk actually in terms of fire increases as you start moving towards fit out. And more often than not, you'll find that actually fires will occur at the very end of a project. So as I mentioned, a lot of the fires that we've seen actually have had hot work permits. So we're looking to try and make these a bit more robust. So again, I often find that hot work permits are kind of seen as a tick box exercise. So where I've sort of gone to a contractor and had a look at their hot work permit system, their folder containing all the permits, I feel like often I could actually just photocopy one permit and they will look the exact same as the rest of them. And I think we're just being a little bit lax in terms of the permit system. And I'm just going to go through like sort of three areas: the pre-works, the works themselves, and post-works, and just seeing what we can do to try and maybe make these a bit more robust. So I think the first question you should always ask yourself before you even do a permit or before you start the works is ask yourself what could go wrong. So the GIRI message is, pause for 5 and think. and I think this is a perfect example of it, is what could you set a light to in the immediate vicinity by doing your hot work activity? So not just thinking about what's in front of you, thinking about, have you got any voids nearby? Are there any combustible materials in the room? But also thinking about the substrate of what you're actually doing your hot works on. So again, things that you might not be able to see. I think you have to just think beyond immediately looking at the item that you're doing hot work on, and just doing a sort of worst case scenario and planning for it. I mean, my recommendation would always be a visual inspection should be done of the works area before, as part of the permit, like as you put together the permit. So when you're actually doing a pre-work check, this should be done by someone independent to the person doing the work, because I just think a fresh pair of eyes who actually might know the area better than the person actually doing the hot work. So my recommendation would always be the person who's actually approving the permit for use should be the person who's actually doing the checks. And now you've got a robust measure. You've got two people looking at the area just to see whether it's actually suitable to do the hot work. Again, we mentioned, you may be asked to evidence whether you've done a pre-check. Again, take photographs of the area and append these to your hot work permit to demonstrate that the area was clean. All combustible materials were either protected or removed. And again, you can use this if you were ever asked, if it's ever needed, to document as evidence as to did the work. Again, I think just checking competency. Again, the person who's approving the hot work permit should be, again, checking to make sure that the person who's doing the work has got the relevant qualifications and is competent to do it. And again, just checking, we've seen before where one of the fire extinguishers in the fire was actually the wrong type. It'd been partially extinguished, partially used, and it had also wasn't serviced. So again, just ensuring that all these checks are done. They sound simple, and I'm sure everyone will say, yeah, we do all this. But we're finding examples where this is not the case, and the risk of a fire is not something that, we can take chances with. And just the last point on the pre-work check, it's just looking at your environment again, but not just actually what you can set alight as to what can make this situation worse. Again, are there any voids that if a fire were to start, you might start setting fire to the remainder of the building? Are there any wind conditions that you need to consider? Again, the fire in the first one was exacerbated by the fact that it was exposed to the elements and the wind drove the fire up the chimney breast. And again, if the question had been asked, should we really been carrying out the hot works in that area, the answer might have actually been no. Or we could have put a windbreak in place made from non-combustible materials. So again, just employing people just to think about the bigger picture and what can go wrong. And again, I'll show you a video in a short while, but you can see the two images there. That's a guy just doing some hot works, and you can see on the right-hand side, that's immediately behind what he's hot working. So you can see where the flame, it actually extends beyond the area that you're doing the hot work. And that's why we ask you to carefully check as to what you're doing the hot work on. And again, this was illustrated by the Dusseldorf fire in the late 80s, early 90s. Again, someone was doing some hot work on a piece of tarmac, and then it ended up setting a light to some combustible material below. Lives were lost and caused an extensive amount of damage. So think about what you're doing your hot work on. During the works, again, you should never leave them unattended. And just one area that we actually focus on when we chat to contractors is actually what you do during breaks, because we often find that hot work permits are open all day, but actually no one really gives much thought as to what happens when people go on lunch. And what we ask is just to ensure that there's always someone there responsible for either carrying out the work, so it's never left unattended. But if you do have to go for a lunch break and you're doing the hot work, that someone is left there who's competent, who's doing a fire watch, and is dedicated solely to doing that task. So they aren't, you know, in the room looking at something else, they're actually physically responsible for ensuring that they're doing the fire watch. So that person, while they have their break, we're confident that no fire can really start during that period, or if it does start, then someone can react immediately. And again, we've had an example of where that wasn't done. Or if you do have to take a break and that's not option's not available, so you have to leave the, you know, the works unattended, then we really would recommend that the permit isn't open all day. It's limited to the duration of the works while you be there, and obviously you do a fire watch at the end of that period before you take your break. And then post-work checks. Again, this is where one thing we come across is, again, the fire watches. I think some people just think that this is just a 60-minute or 30-minute or 2-hour check where you come back to the site after that period just to check everything's okay. Well, actually, this fire watch should be continuous, at least I think for the first 60 minutes if you've got a 60-minute fire watch. You know, obviously we don't want the fire to start shortly after you leave and then come back in an hour, obviously, to find that there's a fire. And also, just when you're doing your fire watch check, don't just check again your immediate vicinity. Think about the other areas around you. Again, asking the question, what can we set alight? So checking voids. Is there any flaming embers or any embers in the voids? And checking any combustible materials that might be nearby that couldn't be removed but have been protected. Again, checking those. So really doing a robust fire watch check. And my recommendation would be, again, the person who's signing off the permit should be the person who's doing the watch, or should at least attend for the duration of the watch, just to ensure that, you know, there isn't any fire that's actually occurred. Again, it's not that we don't trust the person necessarily doing the hot work, but again, it's just a second pair of eyes. Again, when this happens, it's low frequency, but when it does happen, it can be tragic. Thankfully, the examples that Matt went through before, you know, we didn't suffer any loss of life, but you know that could be just lucky. But also, it's quite you know, it's quite costly and can cause significant delays. And the one thing we recommend is actually just taking evidence that you've actually completed the fire watch. So again, just simply taking a photograph. I'll touch upon thermal imaging cameras in a bit, but again, just documenting that, you know, you were there, you took regular photographs of your fire watch period, and you can append that to your hot work permit. And again, if you can provide all this documentation that you did your pre-work checks, you did your post-work checks, in the, you know, in the unfortunate event that a fire occurs and then you are questioned as to show evidence that you did this, if you append this all to your hot work permit, you know, you can then clearly show that, and you know, you're less likely to run the risk of you know, not receiving coverage as a result. So I'm just going to show you a little video we put together at Zurich, and it will bring me on to technology, but hopefully this works. Just go. Okay, so you can see the screen, so I'll just run you through. It's got no sound, but I'll talk you through it. It's only a minute long. So again, that's just reiterating some of the facts we stated at the start. And again, you'll see here that someone's just using a blowtorch just to do some hot work on a roof. And again, I'll just pause that here. Again, you can see the flame coming through through the materials that are used, and obviously there's combustible material behind there. Again, it really explains why checking your substrate is really important. And again, this will zoom in a little bit, and then you'll start seeing actually, you know, a little small fire starting, and that's all it takes. You know, just that 5-minute activity could cause a significant fire. So something that we are looking at in Zurich and trying to promote is just the use of thermal imaging cameras. And again, I'll touch on this in a second, but again, these can just help, you know, reduce that risk, particularly in areas where it's not as easy to see whether, you know, your fire has started. Okay, Okay, so I'll just go back to the presentation. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so again, just looking at technology, again, we just showed you thermal imaging cameras. That's something I'm seeing more and more of when I go and see construction sites. Contractors are using these as part of the firewatch process. So again, that's something we would encourage. It's not something I would say should replace your firewatch, but it's something that is an additional tool that you could use. So again, it's just to help identify potential areas of fire where you might not be able to see it with your naked eye. So again, any sort of voids that aren't necessarily easy to see, that might be dark, that you can't see into, thermal imaging camera would be perfect for that. I would just like to obviously caveat that just to make sure, you know, thermal imaging cameras do have limitations, and it's really important to understand the limitations of those. But again, it's quite a useful tool to use in addition to your current practices, not to replace them. And again, these can produce images, again, that you can use and append to your hot work permit to demonstrate that you did carry out a hot work. You know, and again, this is something that I'm seeing contractors use more and more. So if you do want any feedback on that, then feel free to get in contact. And just something else we're looking at Zurich, and it's just piloting at the moment, just the use of smart permits. So again, it's just using electronic hot work permit rather than a paper-based. And again, I see real advantage in this in being that you can actually, it's quite easy to then upload photographs and download, upload thermal imaging images to these permits as well. So it's great for QA purposes. And also it just means that you can be alerted and notified when permits are open, closed, when firewatches are being completed, etc. So it's something that's worth looking into. And again, if you want contact about what we're doing at Zurich on that, and we do have some clients and contractors who are actually piloting this at the moment for us. So, and again, just looking at the NRFFC's Safe to Torch scheme, something I would recommend looking into. You know, this again is just looking at to try and reduce hot work fires on roofs. Again, this is where we see an awful lot of hot work fires starting is on roofs. They've actually got some good guidance and checklists in there that I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation that's worth going to again. So the video that we produced was in conjunction with them. Okay, so just I've only got 2 more slides left, and then we'll open it up the floor to questions to try and answer some of the questions so far. But Scandinavia had a real issue with hot work fires in the 80s, and I just to ask you a question as to what percentage of fires that they were seeing on average were caused by hot works. So I've given you sort of 4 options, if you wouldn't mind, just give me your thoughts on what percentage of fires were caused by hot works. And I'll give you about a minute to do that while I hydrate my throat. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for responding. So it was actually, I mean, at peaks, it was coming up to 40%. The 5-year average in the late 80s was about 23%. But you could see there was a trend of it going up. So from 1986, it increased from about 12% all the way up to 23% as an average. So obviously, the Scandinavians addressed this as a real issue, and then wanted to try and nip this in the bud before it started escalating into even further problems. So what they did is in the early 90s, they made it mandatory for all persons doing hot work to have a hot work passport. So this is like a 1-day course, and it gives you training in hot works and just all the hot work permit procedures, everything you need to be thinking about with hot works. And it gave you a sort of a license to do hot works for 5 years. So that was mandatory for anyone. And they introduced it into the 90s. So I've just got a question for you then. Since they introduced that, just a simple training system, what do you think the percentage went down to? I think I'll give the example of 2013. So currently, what do you think it will be down now? You can name any percentage, it doesn't have to be a range if you don't want to. Okay, so most people are saying 0 to 10, 10%, something in that ballpark. Okay, so again, just bringing up that graph, you can see obviously in 1989 we're looking at 23%. You know, that steadily decreased over a period of about 5 or 6 years. That started going down to below 10%, and currently, in 2013, which is the date I've got the information up to, it's about 3%. So just a simple system that was mandated to all hot work operatives to do this one-day course reduced hot work fires by that amount. So again, something that we're quite keen on in Zurich to see is, you know, is specific training, and it's something that we do ask for when we go around construction sites as to what training you're doing. Again, just something that's simple and effective. These courses only cost a couple £100, and it can, you know, reduce hot work fires by that much. Is quite incredible. So again, just, you know, the FPA have a similar course. I've been on that myself, and you know, it's just a one-day course, license, and then it doesn't make you necessarily competent to use that particular hot work material, or, you know, acetylene, etc. But what it does do, it just acts as a good refresher, just to ensure that you're really up to speed as to what you should be doing. It goes through HSFG 168, and it's beneficial. I'd also recommend actually just putting through your hot work operatives through fire marshal training as well. Just again, ingraining into the thought as to thinking about what you're doing, and again, what the effect of you're doing and what could go wrong. Again, thinking about, you know, fire extinguishers, what you're doing your hot works on. So something I would investigate, and we recommend it at Zurich. And again, just linking back to GIRI and their you know, their sort of one of their mantras is to pause for 5. And again, that's something I would always encourage, you know, with every construction activity, but hot works in particular, is just stop and think about what you're doing before you do it. And again, they've got some good management and supervisor skills that, you know, again, would tie into hot works. And then lastly, I'm just going to just briefly talk about fire compartmentation and smoking. Again, often we see on construction sites, they're quite, you know, they're evolving. They often have voids connecting floor to floors within certain floors. And often, obviously, fire compartmentation can't fully happen until you get towards the very late stages of a project. But what we would encourage is actually just trying to install temporary compartmentation or the permanent compartmentation as early as you can to reduce that risk. So looking at your sort of key conduits of a fire would be your risers, your lift shafts, any stairwells, putting fire rated doors, boarding on those conduits just to help prevent fire spread. So it's not necessarily obviously going to stop a fire, but it will help limit the damage. And by limiting the damage, it's not only obviously the limit of the damage of the fire itself, but also what you'll also find is that the water damage from the fire brigade will probably cause you as much damage as the fire in some occasions. So if you can limit the extent of it, you're limiting the damage on those two fronts. Again, also looking to see if you can install risers, sprinkler, dry risers, wet risers, sprinklers, smoke detection as early as you can. We appreciate that's hard sometimes, but the earlier you can get this into your project, the better. Sorry, and then lastly, just smoking. Again, it's improved over the years. You know, with the no smoking ban, people probably taking up smoking less, but it's still prevalent on site. We still see it on several, you know, construction projects that we go and see every year. Smoke butts lying on the ground, you know, the odd person smoking, and it really needs to have a zero tolerance on this. We can't afford, you know, fires to be starting due to people smoking. It's just not acceptable. So again, just looking at providing adequate shelters, smoking shelters in suitable locations. There's been several occasions where I've seen smoking shelters located inside buildings, which is just not acceptable. You know, there's guidance in the JCOB on this that they should be a certain distance away from buildings, and that also includes site offices as well, because if fire were to start, and it might not affect your main construction project, but it might actually affect your site offices, and that will cause delays, again, for a small amount of damage to your offices. So they should be suitably located. And again, just consider again the number and of smoking shelters that you provide. Again, we're not saying don't provide these. We'd rather, in a way, some sense, provide them, because we'd rather encourage people to go to a specific place to smoke than obviously having no provisions at all, and then running the risk that people will just smoke where they wish. So again, this is something that we shouldn't really be talking about in 2021, but it's something unfortunately we still need to address. So that's it from me today on this. You think on the start of the slide that Matt produced has our contact details. So if you did have any questions, feel free to email us afterwards. I'll go through the chat function, but if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask, then feel free. I've just shown you some links to some best practice guidance documents that we use at Zurich, if you're not familiar with them. Again, so take a look at those. So if you do have any questions, then feel free to have a look. I'm just going to go.
We've got a few in the chat box, which I can read out. Thanks very much, Robert and Matthew. Also, just to say that the recording will be available on the YouTube website, and also the slides will be available to download. So if you need those contact details and so on, you'll be able to get them. Okay, we've got a first question from Dan Martin. It says, does the panel believe the current version of the JCOP goes far enough to provide suitable guidance on how to effectively manage fires in high-rise construction? And there's a second question, is the recommendation of temporary fire protection every 10 floors really that efficient in reducing the impact of a fire during construction in high-rise?
I mean, I would say if you can install temporary compartmentation in as many floors as you can, and that can limit the fire spread, then the more the better. So I wouldn't necessarily say it should be done every 10 floors. I think you have to take a reasonable look at this and think, can I go above and beyond this? I know when I work on projects, for instance, involving cross-laminated timber, so timber frame structures, they are quite onerous on their compartmentation. So they will limit, they'll make each floor fully compartmented before they start moving on to the next floor. So again, this is where I think we should start to sort of move more towards. But again, it's what is reasonable and what's practical. There's always that balance in construction. In an ideal world, we'd have all our fire systems, permanent fire systems, all there and in place, before we start doing some other activities. But we appreciate that's not feasible, but just trying to do as much as you can. Hopefully that answers your question.
If you've got any comments, or if you want to add anything to that, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Robert, much appreciated. It is a difficult balance, as you quite rightly say, with regard to high-rise construction and, trying to find, sometimes rises are designed to be quite large, and then trying to provide a suitable temporary fix for that temporary fire protection every 10 floors or more frequently if you can, is always going to be a challenge. But I think sometimes with some of the designs that we've got where we still have single means of access and egress up and down the building, I do wonder whether temporary fire protection should really be highlighted and made a stronger point of, because the impact that it has for anybody working on those upper levels. If there's an intermediate fire developing, then when you've got a single means of escape, that I feel could compromise our teams working on those upper floors.
So should that be in the specification, in the requirements for the project, so everybody looks to do it, or should it be left to the contractors once they take possession of the site? So that's where the balance is, isn't it? Because at the end, in the end, it comes down to money and who's going to pay for it.
Exactly.
And if a contractor has priced a job without it in, it makes life difficult, doesn't it?
It does, definitely. And I think, you know, from previous experience, I've seen examples where that hasn't necessarily been considered. And then they've had an external fire risk assessor come in and identify it. And then the cost is quite substantial to put all the temporary fire doors, for instance, or horizontal fire protection and the like. So it does need to be thought about at design stage. Design teams, procurement managers, and so on and so forth need to be building that into their thought process so they can budget for it accordingly, because it is quite important, in my opinion, that it is thought about sooner.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree anymore. I think the more conversations that I had with clients and designers, just to, you know, that's why I sort of mentioned about the sort of the dialogue between all parties involved. I think it's really important to raise that, because raising it once you've tendered and you've secured the work and then saying, oh, by the way, can we have this? You know, there's an additional cost associated with that. And again, if contractors will happily price for this and include it as long as they know about it at the time. So yeah, I think there's a lot of education that this is not just obviously aimed at contractor level. This is also educating clients and designers as well, hopefully, to start thinking about these things.
Agreed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question from Paul Lowe. Says, GIRI has advocated investment in design and operative competence. Government's seeking to address these issues with the Building Safety Bill. Should the bill be extended to all building types?
So I'm just having a little think about that one. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not overly familiar with the Building Safety Bill. So, but I assume that it's in light of what's happened at Grenfell, and you know, it's looking at properties in a permanent condition. Again, I think, you know, there needs to be, and I know something that we're looking at with CLT is looking at having a sort of in property they haven't, we had your approved document B, or you have it, but there's also a modified version which is also asking for insurance requirements. So again, that's something we are contemplating, something for the construction of using cross-laminated timber. So I think, you know, whether it should be included, I couldn't answer that question, but again, it's just something we always should be considering the construction stage of a project, particularly when we're refurbishing a project. You probably would have seen a lot of the fires in recent years they've also tended to be refurbished projects as well. So you've got this existing structure that's going through refurbishment, that's also partially in operation, but also actually under construction. And that's actually where we're seeing a large number of fires in the past 3 or 4 years. You only have to Google, you know, Glasgow School of Art, Cameron House, and all these places, they're all sort of going under refurbishment. So, you know, if it might not be necessarily a permanent condition, but if refurbishment works are included, then that's required in the bill, then yes. But sorry, the bill slightly beyond me.
The Building Safety Bill, although it uses the word safety, it's very much a quality statement, and achieving the right specific, getting things specified correctly and then building them properly and having that checked by an independent checker. I think in some respects the fire issues relate more to the safety side of life. The development of the HSE's controls on safety, and the cultural change we've had in the industry with regard to accidents. I think that the fire issue sits on construction sites, sits more in a line with that than, shall we say, the Building Safety Bill. But like all of us, we're probably still getting our minds around what the impact this Building Safety Bill is going to have on construction once we all get to grips with it.
Can I just add, I think that's why partly they've used the term in-scope buildings, because it enables them in the future to be able to bring on into the bill other things like hotels, residential accommodation, such as care homes and and that type of thing. Anything with a sleeping accommodation, that's my understanding. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual bill, it covers fire safety as well as the structural elements of the construction as well, doesn't it? And I think the other thing to bear in mind is the fact that you've got the competency steering group that's fallen out of the back of everything from Grenfell, and the fact that there is going to be much more onus put onto demonstrating suitable competence for the installation of various different fire safety and fire protection systems during construction. And it even goes down to the competency levels of our principal contractors, designers, procurement managers, and so on and so forth as well. So it's quite far-reaching when you look at that side of things.
Yeah.
Just
it's going to make a big. It's going to have a big impact.
Yeah. Sorry, Dave.
No, I'm carry on.
Sorry, Dan, you were going to say something, I think.
No, negative. You carry on. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think this it's a good question, Paul. I think we may have discussed this in one of the members' meetings, and I think instinctively a lot of people were of the view that perhaps, yeah, it shouldn't just be applied to one category of building type. It should extend to all, because the impact of doing this kind of exercise, if it saves any loss of life or injury, is worth doing. I appreciate obviously it would have a cost implication, but I think instinctively it should be widened out.
Yeah, we always come back to what's reasonably practicable and all that sort of terminology, don't we, when you come to how much things are implemented.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any other questions in the chat box, so unless anybody wants to unmute themselves and speak, very welcome to. Otherwise, maybe I'll ask Cliff to wrap up.
I was just going to say, it's nice to hear from Dan about saying that they're also using thermal imaging cameras and electronic hot work permits as well. So it's good to hear that obviously, others are using this as well. And it's good for managing the hot work process as well.
Yeah, we introduced it after speaking with you guys actually, and we implemented it on some of the grade 2 listed buildings where we were doing an element of hot works, and so it gave a little bit of added reassurance for the site teams, I'd suggest. But I mean, one of the other points I just thought would be quite useful is that from my inspections on construction sites is the fact that during those closing stages where you've got introduction of high fire loading, you've got more adhesives and so on with flammable vapor and one thing and another. Last week I attended a site and there was lots of open cans of adhesives with highly flammable vapor, which was sinking down at lower levels where potentially there was a risk of ignition. And I think sometimes that on construction sites gets overlooked.
Yeah, I've seen the same where we've had chemicals which have just been sitting on a platform, concrete slab. If you just looked at them close inspection, you think, okay, obviously they should be bonded, but what could go wrong? But then you look close inspection and you see voids going from floor to floor. And again, all these things just sort of add up to the risk. So yeah, it's still work to do.
I just refer to the point John made about major contractors having the controls, but the subcontractors do the work. Yes, that's always going to be a problem, I guess, but we've got to get better at it, haven't we? Implementation's got to be improved, and I think the more that we realise the loss of not only money but the loss of life that can result from not doing things right is a lesson for us all. So if we haven't got any more questions coming through, firstly, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Matthew, for that insight into the insurance side of life when it comes to construction fires. I think picking up on some of Matthew's examples, the gap between the loss and the payout, assuming that the loss is accurate and the payout's accurate, there are some big lumps of money that are floating around there, not being picked up. And this is the sort of issue that GIRI's really targeting, where we're the industry's losing money because it's not doing things right. And had those issues been, those examples, had steps been put in place in the first place, then those lumps of money wouldn't have been lost, both by the insurer and by the individuals who picked up the gap.
Yeah, absolutely, Viv.
I see that we're picking up on the building safety bill, and I think we as an industry have got a lot more work to do in fully understanding the implications of that. But such discussions as today are all helping in that direction. Another thing I picked up from the examples, and certainly from my own experience, I was with a main contractor for 38 years, is the question of documentation. And I've unfortunately had to deal with some legal implications of situations in the past, and I can tell you from my painful experience that if you haven't got the documentation, if you haven't got the records of what you've been doing and how you've been doing it, it'll come back and bite you. So I support Matthew in his examples where he says the documentation was inadequate, and so the insurers are less likely to pay out. So it's a lesson for us all to learn. There is a lot of similarity with the whole safety environment, and I think again, this idea of avoidance versus mitigation. If you can avoid the risk in the first place, it's far more effective than coming up with ways of mitigating. I think that's again really true point. And with fire, I think it's perhaps not done as much during the whole risk assessment stage as we are now doing with safety. And I'm pleased that there's that connection mentioned by Robert with regard to training. GIRI are a training organisation now through our partners at GTC, and you can get access to that through our website, and certainly supervisors and management training picks up on these issues. So thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today. I hope that you found it interesting and informative. And I think there are some contact details that you can get back to us if you've got any questions that come to mind after the event, as often happens. And again, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Matthew. And I hope to see you all at some future forum.